Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. Please, if you don't mind, to keep yourself muted. At the end, we'll have time for Q&A, and you can always. Very important. Tonight's event is going to be a bit of an intense topic. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask that you'd prefer to be anonymous, you don't want to put it in the chat, feel free to send it as a chat or to me directly or to one of the other rabbis, or you can email it to me. And if you are somebody that I know and you'd prefer that I don't know the question you'd like to ask, send it as a message to one of the other rabbis and they'll pass it along. But no questions are off the table for tonight, but it is a special event for me. So we'll get started. Tonight's a heavy topic, but we are fortunate to have Rabbi Zippel with us. Rabbi Zippel, in addition to being an amazing rabbi, happens to be my brother-in-law. And I was able to watch his story, which he's going to share with us from the sidelines. Not the original part of the story, but the healing part of the story was able to watch from the sidelines. It's an honor for me to have him share with us a little bit of his story and how he's overcome the challenges. And today there's a lot of talk and a lot of support out there, whether it be mental health, suicide, drug addiction, sexual abuse. And a lot of these topics are spoken about. Sexual abuse is not as spoken about as a lot of these other topics. And there's a lot of stigma and shame around sexual abuse. And many people suffer silently. With the Me Too movement, we've been able to see many people coming forward. Of course, in the celebrity world, a lot of celebrities came forward and shared their story with sexual abuse. But on the individual level, a lot of us still struggle and have challenges associated with their past. So we're honored to have Rabbi Zippel here to share with us and help us unpack some of this for us as well. Tonight's event is a partnership between three different Chabads. The Chabad of Coal Valley in San Francisco, the Chabad of Novato, just a little bit north of San Francisco, I believe, and the Los Altos Chabad, just a bit of south. So we're trying to cover the peninsula and the North Bay all together. In order to kick this evening off, I'm going to start with Rabbi Potash of Chabad of Coal Valley to introduce himself and to share a couple words, and then Rabbi Landau, and then off to Rabbi Zippel.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nassim Potash, Rabbi at Chabad of Coal Valley, and I'm so delighted to be here with people from not just Chabad of Coal Valley, but from other communities as well. This is obviously a big topic and one that there's a lot of emotion in, and for me it is something that I think is really important that we have these kinds of conversations, because there's so many learnings that we can take from them, as well as lessons that we can learn about how to prevent certain things happening. So I'm really delighted that Rabbi Avremi Zippel has chosen to join our communities and give us some inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Potash. And now I'd like to introduce Rabbi Landau and of Chabad of Novato to share a few words, maybe say a word of inspiration as well. And you have to unmute.
Hi, could you hear me? Everyone, you're good?
We hear you now.
Yep.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. Rabbi Landa here. Great to see some familiar faces, some new faces. Today, the 11th of Shvat, is the day exactly 70 years ago when the Rebbe assumed the mantle of leadership at Chabad. And he said in that first evening of his public address, a mission statement. He put together a statement. He's saying when we assume a new role, people want to hear something shocking, something new, a new position. And the Rebbe said that evening 70 years ago that the love of God, the love of Torah, and the love of a fellow Jew go hand in hand. You may think that if I have the love of God, I'm good. I'm working on that. Or maybe if I have the love of Torah, I'll seclude myself and put my full love in the Torah. You can't have one without the other. And the greatest key to all three is when you love a fellow Jew, when you show unconditional, full love for another person and another Jew. From there, you ascend and you reach the next step, love of Torah and then the love of God. And the Rebbe even went further and said that if you really want to understand Torah, it'll come through sharing and teaching whatever level of Torah you know to share it to another. And as Rabbi Schusterman mentioned earlier, that he's in the south, Rabbi Potash is a little more north, and we're further north. One of the Rebbe's visions and dreams was to fulfill that verse of the Torah that says, Ufaratzta, that we will go out with strength to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. So wherever we are, whether it's the north of the Bay Area or the south of the Bay Area, but in truth, every place of the world with Rabbi Zippel, a little to the east, we're fulfilling that mission and the purpose. And we have to remember we can never lose focus and lose sight of the destination to bring Mashiach. And Avremi, it's great to see you. We share some WhatsApp chats together, but also you and your dad were a great help just recently with someone in our community, the Satkins, who their father passed away, and you and your father was an incredible help for them. So it's great to be in this room together and to gain inspiration from you and your incredible story. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Landau. So I'm going to read Rabbi Zippel's bio. It's a short version of his bio because there's a lot more that can be said than said in one or two paragraphs. And then what we're going to do, the way we're going to have this discussion is going to be more of an interview asking Rabbi Zippel questions, and Rabbi Zippel will give us some feedback and answers to our questions. As I mentioned before, feel free to send messages to be added to the conversation, and if it makes sense to incorporate it as we go along, we will do it that way. If it makes sense to include it at the end, we'll do it that way. And again, feel free to keep it anonymous. You can send it to me or to one of the other rabbis if you prefer that I don't know the specific questions. Okay, Rabbi Zippel, my brother-in-law, Avremi. He's a sexual abuse survivor and a mental health advocate. Rabbi Zippel is a Utah-raised rabbi serving the local community since 2014. Knowing Rabbi Zippel, he's been serving the community since he was born, but actively serving the community as an official position since 2014. In February 2019, Rabbi Avremi testified about the decades of childhood sexual abuse he endured at the hands of his family's babysitter as part of the criminal proceedings against her. His testimony made him the first Orthodox rabbi to speak out publicly on such a topic and sparked his career as an advocate and activist for survivors of sexual abuse around the world. Rabbi Zippel is a program director and spiritual leader at Chabad of Utah, together with his wife, Shana, who is Nechama's sister. By telling his story, he hopes to show the world, and especially the Orthodox community in particular, that survivors can be resilient, successful, and strong. And without further ado, we will bring in Rabbi Zippel. So Rabbi Zippel, before we start, do you have anything you want to open the evening with?
Well, first of all, thank you all very much for having me. This is, I guess, one of the geographic locations where I feel somewhat familiar. I'm very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to be with communities around the United States and the world more recently, and this is actually a geographic makeup that, due to marrying Shana from Palo Alto, I've spent many a Shabbos in Los Altos, and I think I drove through Coal Valley once, and Rabbi Landau, forgive me, I haven't made it that far north yet on my pilgrimages to Northern California. But thank you all very much for having me. It's an honor to be with you this evening, and really I want to thank the rabbis and rebbitzins that are co-hosting and sponsoring this evening. I appreciate the opportunity to share my story with your communities. I know it's something which it requires a lot of bravery and courage to bring such a conversation to your community, and as such, I'm very thankful for the opportunity, and I look forward to a very informative and educational and empowering evening together. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask a question or two, and then I'll hand over the mic to Rabbi Landau. So Avremi, or Rabbi Zippel, you grew up in Salt Lake City after the Rabbi of blessed memory sent your parents to Utah to serve there as the Chabad rabbi and rebbitzin. Tell us a little bit about the work that your parents do and what life was like for you growing up in the home of the rabbi.
So in 1992, shortly before the Rebbe was about to turn 90, the Rebbe turned 90 in April of 92, the Chabad as a movement decided that the gift they wanted to give to the Rebbe for his 90th birthday was the founding of a new state, bringing Chabad, a full-time Chabad presence, to a state where it was not yet at that point. Thank God where we are now, we have Chabad in 50 states, but in 92, I think it was still just under 40. And the state that was chosen to be the recipient of this gift was Utah, and the couple that was tapped to move to Utah were my parents. They moved here in the summer of 1992. They were very kind to bring me along for the ride. I think historically, it's been shown that the first Chabad event that took place here in Salt Lake City was my first birthday party. I'm the oldest. I came here. I was the only one they dragged along for the ride. Everyone else was still on the way. And I guess my parents found that a good way to meet people is introduce them to your kids. And so, the housewarming party and meet the rabbi's kids all happened simultaneously. And I grew up on the job, I think there's another way to put it, as is the case for thousands and thousands of children, sons and daughters of Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins around the world. We grow up in a Chabad house environment. And I think as we all learn very quickly, if there are any lines between kind of the personal and the communal life, if they exist at all, they're pretty blurry. And I think being the child of a Chabad rabbi and rebbitzin is a very all-encompassing experience, especially in a town here like Salt Lake City. And I know that different children take to it differently. Some like it more than others. For me, it was something that I took to at a very young age. I think I really embraced the role of being the rabbi's son, and it was something which I took to very naturally. And from a young age, it was something that one day I wanted to do on my own, not just to be in a assisting capacity, but to one day be able to carry that mantle of being the Rebbe's emissary and being a rabbi and being married to a rebbitzin and starting my family in a remote Chabad location of my own. And after leaving home, getting an education, getting married in Northern California, in December of 2014, my wife and I were very fortunate to fulfill a life dream of both of ours, to move out here to Salt Lake and work with the younger segment of the community over here. Thank God Salt Lake City is a very dynamic, growing community where there's a real influx of some young blood, and there was a need for some young blood to be there with that. And here we are ever since. We've had the opportunity to do that, to step into roles that we had always dreamed of, and it's something which we're tremendously grateful for.
It's funny, my father always has this soft spot in his heart for you, because he used to visit Salt Lake City as when Rabbi Avremi was a child, and he loved how Rabbi Avremi was part of the community, and he wasn't just the rabbi's son. He was like the assistant rabbi, even though he was 6 or 7 years old at the time.
He was 4 or 5 when he came, but yeah, point well taken.
Even earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's go to the elephant in the room, which is obviously your childhood was not a simple one. Though on the outside, for many, it seemed the ideal, perfect childhood. But on the inside, there was a lot of stuff going on. Can you share with us a little bit about the events that were going on and what led you to where you are today?
So I'm actually very excited to share this, because usually when I've been answering this question for the past several months now, I've had a specific answer, and I'm delighted that I can finally change it. When I was growing up here in Salt Lake City, there was no formal Jewish educational infrastructure. There's no Jewish day school here in town. And usually when I say that, I say there was not then and there is no now. But I'm actually delighted to announce that we're opening a Jewish day school this coming August. So this is the first opportunity where I can correct the record on that. But be that as it may, when I was a child, there was nowhere for us to go to school. There was no Jewish day school. There was no cheder. There was nothing there for us. And so my siblings and I were homeschooled. And when I say homeschooled, I know that in today's day and age, homeschooled has a number of different interpretations, especially during COVID. But we were quite literally homeschooled. There was a big bedroom in our house that was converted into a classroom. And that's where all of our education took place. We were taught by my parents, and we did the homeschooling thing quite literally before it was a trend, before it was cool. We were, the trailblazers in the homeschooling world. Result of that, with not having a school to go to and not having really a social scene and friends to hang out with, we were home every day, all day. We didn't really have much place to go. And as a result of that, as is pretty common in a Chabad family, there were a number of us kids all kind of being born somewhat close to each other. And in 1998, my parents were expecting my youngest brother, who was number 5 at the time. And with my dad being out of the house all day doing whatever it is the Chabad rabbis do, my parents saw the need to hire full-time help. have an extra set of hands around the house to be of assistance, to kind of be with us as we were home all day. And they asked around, they found someone very highly recommended who was known to a number of families in the community. And so they hired her to, to work in our house. And it was a gig that started off very, very well. About a year later, just after my 8th birthday in September of 1999, our family's babysitter began sexually abusing me. And this was something that happened that I wasn't really in a position to stop or to protest or to bring attention to in the beginning. And as a result of that, it continued. It went on for a very long time. To be exact, it went on for just about a decade. In 2009, just after I turned 18, at that point, most of us had grown up. We were attending yeshivas and high schools outside the home. And so there wasn't the need to have full-time help at home anymore. And so without knowing any of the backstory, my parents on very good terms parted ways with our babysitter. And once she was out of the house, I swore to myself that I would perpetuate whatever I had been doing for every single day until that time, which was take this secret with me to the grave. This was something which I never had any intention of discussing with anybody, and was going to do whatever I could in my power to maintain that status quo. And that's how things progressed. Fast forward a number of years, I got married in 2014, and about 2 years later, right after my wife and I had our first child, I came to realize that the mentality that I had always sought to adopt, of just kind of pushing these things away and not addressing them, and hoping that if I just stopped thinking about them, they would just cease to exist and go up in smoke. It doesn't really work like that. These things don't really just leave you be because that's what you've asked them to do. And I was struggling quite intensely from a number of issues that were going on at that point. And my mother and my father and my wife, the important people in my life, sat me down and told me that I didn't seem to be myself. And they wanted me to go speak to a therapist. They had no clue what was in my past. They wanted me to just kind of go and, have someone tinker with me and make some adjustments and put me back good as new again. And I wasn't very excited about the idea. It turns out that my mother is a very strong Jewish woman who doesn't really take no for an answer. And my wife is a very strong Jewish woman who doesn't really take no for an answer. And so off I went to see the therapist. And it was at that point I decided to tell someone. Clearly it was bothering me on some level and it was affecting me. And so I told him. He was the first human being that I ever said the words to, and they just kind of tumbled out. And I said, I think I was sexually abused as a kid. And we began to work on that. We began to talk about that. We began to process that. We began to realize how that affects me and why that affects me, and what can be done about that. And we began to really go down the road of healing. As part of the healing process, I was, as I began to really understand and grasp the enormity of what had really happened to me, and how illegal that was and how wrong that was, I began to pursue the idea of pressing charges, of doing something to bring up the reality that this was no longer okay. And we had kicked around the idea of going to law enforcement, which was something that I did. I filed the police report in January of 2018. Actually, in 6 days will be the three-year anniversary. And in March of 2018, just a few hours before the Seder, when I was actually in Northern California, in Palo Alto, Salt Lake City Police Department arrested my abuser on suspicion of 130 counts of sexual abuse of a child. And she was charged a week later with multiple first-degree felonies, and thus began the judicial process. And throughout the entire journey, I had made abundantly clear to law enforcement, to the prosecutor's office, that the only way I was going to be a part of this was if they could absolutely guarantee my anonymity. I wanted nothing to do with this in the public world. I was happy to pursue this. No one should know who it was that was behind this all. And they gave me assurances to the best of their ability. In 2019, in the beginning of 2019, it became evident that I was going to have to testify in court for the first time, in open court, where everyone can make all the promises they want until they're blue in the face, but it's open court. Anyone's able to come in with a microphone and a camera and whatever else they choose. And so it became clear that at some point it would be wise for me to tell the story on my own terms, for me to get out of it possibly leaking out in the press or anything of the sort. At that time, the world had changed quite a bit. The Me Too movement had happened. Speaking out about one's experiences was becoming more and more commonplace. And so in February of 2019, on February 5th, the day that I testified in court for the first time about these matters, I told my story in the local paper. It ran that afternoon. And the illusion of my being able to go through this confidentially and anonymously went up in smoke, and I became the survivor of sexual abuse, that persona that I had wanted to avoid for such a long time became my life in a very, very public and prominent way. And make a very long story short, it's really led me to where we are today. It's given me the opportunity to speak out and make an impact about this issue in my community and in the wider community, which is something which I'm tremendously grateful for and thankful for. And ultimately, it really brings us to where we are tonight.
Remy, absolutely amazing. Just hearing you share this, the power, the strength that you have to come forward with this, so that you can make this known and share this with everyone, is really inspiring. In 2018, I was actually with your parents for a Shabbat in Crown Heights. Actually, some people on this call in this session were there with us. Your father spoke, dynamic, very inspirational. This was May 2018, so obviously he knew this, and it was already filed. The charges were filed. It wasn't yet public. And you mentioned February 19 is when you decided to go with the story on your terms. What changed? I guess you knew it was going to be public anyway. You may as well share the story. But what were you hoping for? What changed? What made you want to share your story?
It's a great question, because it's really powerful for me to look back at the way things were not so long ago. This really came about from a logistical reason. It was going to come out, and there were a number of people that were close to the situation that really advised, find someone you can trust and tell the story on your terms and get it out there. But I'll be honest, from when my abuser was arrested and once the court process began, I began to toy with the idea of being public about it. I was very thankful to be in a place of healing. I had been in therapy for 2.5 years at that point. And just because of the logistics that I was having to go to court regularly for hearings, and it became part of my life, one by one, I started telling people on a very small level, and not people that I was telling because they were necessarily extremely close or friendly, just because it was, logistically, these were people who I was working with, and I had to miss an appointment because I had to be in court. Why was I going to court? And I decided to be honest and tell them. And as I told one person and another person and so on and so forth, I became more comfortable with it, which is, something very powerful in its own right. And I really began to toy with the idea of being public on my terms. And I'll never forget, about a month or so, maybe a little bit more before the story ran and I really embraced it, I sat one night in my living room and I pulled out my laptop and I said, you know what? I'm silly for thinking that I'm going to do all this on my own. There's probably somebody out there who's been in a similar situation who I can talk to. So let me find someone that I can network with and who's gone down this road and who can share with me some firsthand experience. So I took out my laptop and I Googled male, Jewish, observant survivor of sexual abuse. I figured, probably BuzzFeed probably has like a top 10 list, and there'll be a whole smorgasbord of people that I could talk to. After about 5 minutes, it became abundantly clear to me that Google knew of no such person. And usually if Google doesn't know of such a person, it's fair to say that such a person doesn't exist. And I remember sitting down and really confronting that reality, that there was no one out there publicly that I could talk to about this. And I remember that reality really came crashing down, and it had a very powerful dual effect. On one hand, it was depressing. It was very sad to know that there was no one out there. It was a very lonely reality. There was no one out there to connect with. But at the same time, I remember it being very empowering. And I remember thinking to myself, there's a good chance I'm not the only person in the world in my specific set of circumstances that's dealing with this. And I know how much I would crave personal connection, and I would love the opportunity to connect with somebody else who's been through something similar. What if this situation has presented itself to me for me to be that person for other people? And instead of sitting here and throwing up my hands and saying, oh, woe is me, I'm so alone, blah, blah, blah. What if this is the opportunity for me to embrace that reality and be that source of comfort and connection and humanity for somebody else? And I think it was really, that reality check of, you find yourself in this situation for a very specific reason that really gave me the push and the motivation to go forward with it.
Amazing. Avremi, that's the courage you have, and knowing that you're going to be able to help and touch other people with this I'm speechless. That's amazing. I remember when your story came public, and I was on a bunch of groups. We were all giving our support for you, but to actually have the courage to go forward and say, I'm going to help other people with this. Was there actually any famous celebrity or someone that you did reach out to, that you did connect with, you did have any inspiration from?
So it's interesting. I mean, I'm very fortunate. It was very surreal to have a connection with Elizabeth Smart. But I grew up here in Salt Lake City, and Elizabeth Smart's kidnapping and disappearance for 9 months was a huge part of my childhood. We didn't sleep for weeks on end because that was the story that every child is scared of, that your parents tell you will never happen, that someone will break into your bedroom in the middle of the night and take you from your bed. That's never supposed to happen. That happened 5 minutes from my house. And so being able to connect with Elizabeth in the adult life, which is a story unto itself, and it was an incredible opportunity. One of the people that I was fortunate to make a connection with, and it's interesting because we were just reconnected over the anniversary, is the entire USA Gymnastics story happened in January of 2018, and the entire sentencing surrounding that. And that was about 10 days before I decided to go to the police. And I think it's fair to say that watching that happen, and watching, dozens and dozens and dozens of people, some celebrities and some, just everyday folk, embracing that reality and getting up in open court on national TV and say, yes, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. And, if you don't like that, too bad for you, was remarkable. And indeed, I went to the police 10 days later. And so, I remember being very taken by Ali Reisman's statement. We connected about it in the moment. She definitely voiced her support recently, and we've been fortunate to be in touch since then. But to me, it really teaches me the lesson of, we live in a world where you do your thing, you bring light to the world, and you have no idea as to who benefits from that in ways that you can never imagine. And I think that being on the receiving end of that sort of inspiration, without those sorts of people knowing how they were impacting me, really gives me encouragement to try and feel the same role in other people's lives.
Amazing. Wow. Avremi, wow. If this has been personal until now, it's going to get a little more personal. The next question I want to ask, being raised as a son of a rabbi and now a rabbi and a role model yourself, I want to ask you about your healing process, and specifically in your role as a rabbi. Do you have questions that come up that you struggle in answering, that you find an answer to? Specifically, I want to ask you, when you've spoken about in the past, and I read it, that when your nanny was finally charged, you said that was the most healing thing you could have done. But you also said that going to acknowledge that something terrible has been done to me, what kind of God lets that happen? So how do you deal with these questions? What role does Hashem, God, play in your healing process? I'm asking you as a friend, as an individual, but also as a rabbi, if you could address that.
If I can add to that question, somebody sent me in the chat, being a rabbi, and how did this affect you as part of your community? You're a religious person. This is something that, as far as we can tell, or so we think, I'd say, growing up in the religious communities, it only happens on TV. It only happens out of the religious community. And here you are, one of the guys who this is happening to. How did this affect you, and how did you begin your healing process through that?
So it's interesting. I'll share with you guys a somewhat unrelated anecdote, but I always chuckle when it comes up. God became a part of the healing process very early on, not just because of my lifestyle and who I am. When we had this pivotal conversation about my going to therapy, I made one condition with my parents and my wife, and that was I didn't want a Jewish therapist. I didn't want someone from the community who had their opinions about Judaism and the rabbi and all that. I wanted to go to a nice Goyish therapist. And, in all fairness, I live in Salt Lake City. There are approximately 4,000 Jews in Salt Lake City, in a city of 1.2 million people. How difficult could it be to find a non-Jewish therapist in Salt Lake City? And so my father made some calls, and he found someone very, very highly recommended, did not have a Jewish sounding name at all. And so off I went to see Dr. Mitchell Coles. And I'm sitting in this first session talking to him, and I made a reference to a really Jewish slang term. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, let me explain what I mean." And he says, "Oh, I know what you mean." I said, "How do you know what I mean?" He says, "I grew up in the Bronx." "You mean I'm Jewish?" And I remember thinking to myself, "Are you kidding me?" The one thing I asked for, I spend my entire life as a Chabad rabbi in Salt Lake City trying to find Jews in Salt Lake City. And the one situation where I did not want to find the Jew in Salt Lake City, I ended up with a Jewish shrink. So we kind of had this dynamic because, when I decided to be treated by him, stay with him, he really kind of went out of his way to say, I get this whole Jewish rabbi thing, but God's not gonna, I'm not gonna bring God into this room. That's gonna be your choice if you want to. And I think that it's a very misunderstood part of my story. I think when a lot of people, hear the Chabad rabbi with the beard and the hat and all that talking about healing and hope and faith, no one would be shocked if I got up and said, oh, thank goodness that I'm who I am, because my strong faith in God just nourished me every day and got me through this, and I never had any problems with that. I think that people almost expect that, and the reality is it couldn't be further from the truth. I've said many times in conversations like these that I think it's accurate to say that the Almighty God and I have a very, very complicated relationship, and what I mean by that is, I often think about the fact, when I look back on how things have gone, I spent a very, very, very long time in my life, a significant chunk of it, being pretty adamantly convinced that the Almighty God hated me. And I want to clarify that for a sec. When I was being abused as a kid, I really didn't have the vernacular or the vocabulary to really understand the dynamics of what was going on. And as such, like many, many children, didn't really believe that what was happening to me qualified as abuse, as something criminal. To me, it was something immoral, which I wasn't protesting and I wasn't putting up a fight against. And so as such, I was definitely culpable for a part of it. And if I was culpable for a part of it, starting at 8 years old, it's a very childish thing to think and to say, but I was a child when this started. God hated me, and he was justified in doing so. I was not really doing what I should be doing. And this went on for a very long time. And I'll tell you, growing up as a young person, believing that God hates you and that kind of being the pervading reality for a long time is tough. It's not a great place to be in. Once I started therapy and I began to really realize what had happened and what that is classified as, and that I was, the victim of a crime, I realized that there was a more painful place than believing that God hated me. And that was coming to grips with the fact that it seemed like God had forgotten about me. It almost seems like God had ignored me. And that was tough. That was tougher than believing that God hated me, because, especially being a Chabad rabbi and having the lens of God, of Hashem, through the chassidus that we learn and we teach, and believing that God is not just, some creature in a faraway land. God is all seeing and all knowing and all powerful and all capable, et cetera, et cetera. So with all that being true, where was he when all this was going on? It didn't just happen once or twice or a dozen times. It happened for years and years and years. And did you miss the memo? Did you choose to not realize what was happening to me at that time? And those are tough questions. And Rabbi Landa, to answer your question specifically, those are tough questions that you never really get an answer to. There's never a good answer that you'll find to the questions, where was God when all this was going on? How could this have happened? What kind of God is okay with this? What I am fortunate for is that through my experiences of having the ability to use what happened to me as a catalyst for good and being able to find positivity and purpose through everything that's happened to me, it's given me a little bit of perspective into why this happened to me, and why this happened to me through the lens of pain and suffering that I'll never have an answer to. And in that sense, I join myself to the legions of people around the world who undergo some form of pain and suffering. But why this happened to me, so that I could somehow use my experiences to bring about some good in the world, I think being able to see that actualized has been the most healing process. And being able to see how something good could come out of something so negative, that has really, really, truly been a very, very healing process, and has really patched up things, I guess you'd say. It's not an easy process, and it's a process which continues to have its good days and its bad days, but I'm thankful that it's come to some place of resolution.
Thank you, Avremi. That's it's amazing how you're able to see God through the struggle, have your struggle with him, and at the same time, not just dump him out. And a lot of times, people on this journey, just, God, if you don't give me what you want or what I want or what I need, you're out. And, part of it is the struggle with God and being able to embrace God even when we're upset at him. So it's amazing that you're.
I want to, Rabbi, if I could just jump in there for a sec, because the way you put it gave me such a powerful reminder. In our community, in the Chabad community, we're all mourning a very intense loss that happened on Thursday. A lot of us lost a friend, a colleague, Rabbi Yudi Dukes, a 39-year-old father of 6 from New York, who had COVID from the very beginning, and he was in the hospital for 241 days. And sadly, tragically, he succumbed to his injuries this past Thursday. And so it's been a long journey. His family's been very public about the ups and the downs. And so on Friday morning, his wife, who's been very expressive and vocal about the family's experiences through all of this, she wrote about, where she was on the first day of Shiva for her husband. And she put a line in there that affected me so profoundly. She said, I want to convey to God that I'm deeply disappointed by him. And I thought that was so profound, because so many times when we're in a place of pain and suffering, we make the very conscious decision, as Rabbi Shusterman said, to dump God, to just walk away from him, feel like he has forsaken us, so we forsake him back and we want nothing to do with him. And no one can blame us for making that decision. But to feel disappointed by God, disappointed speaks to a place of a relationship where, God, we have a relationship with one another, and there are expectations for how you and I are going to treat each other. And frankly, I'm not okay. I'm not okay with you, taking away my 39-year-old woman and leaving behind 6 orphans. It's disappointing, but disappointing speaks of a desire to have a relationship where we do understand, where we want to make sense of it, where we want to grow from it, where we're not just saying, God, forget this, you messed with me, I'm going to mess with you back, and I want nothing to do with you anymore. It was profound the way she expressed her disappointment, and I want to know what's going on. I'm not tolerating, I'm not just taking this on the chin and say, okay, you killed my husband, it is what it is. I'm disappointed by you because I expect better of you, and I want to know why this happened. I want to gain understanding. And to me, having that sort of relationship with a God and expressing that disappointment and sharing with God, I'm not okay with the status quo, and I want to see how you're going to help me through this, to me is such a profound level to aspire to.
Well, Avremi, they say Chabad rabbis are wise, but the wisdom you have, I'm assuming also from what you've gone through, you had to learn quite quickly. It's just Dayenu. If I'm going to take away one message already just from hearing you, what you just shared is something incredible. I'm getting some questions in the chat directly, so I'm just going to combine them,
Sure.
a couple together. I'm just going to ask you 3 questions, and you could combine them maybe in one. Were any other of your siblings molested? Do you ever blame your parents of what happened? And I guess for now we'll leave it at that, and I'll circle back to ask other ones. But just if you could.
So to date, no one else. My abuser cared for a number of families all at the same time, and to date, no one else has come forward as having been abused by her. And as I often say in these settings, if you ask 100 child psychologists if that's common, that an abuser fixates on one victim, they'll tell you it's very, very common. And if you ask another 100 psychologists if it's common, they'll tell you it's highly uncommon. We could debate the academia all night until we're blue in the face. It is what it is on a certain level, and people can debate the finer points of how normal that is or not. In terms of my parents, the way the question was phrased gives me the opportunity to answer it very directly. I do not blame my parents, not one bit. I'm very thankful that the healing process that I've gone through has really given me the opportunity to realize that predators who engage in this sort of behavior don't do it by accident. They don't do it because it's a crime of circumstance. They do it because they know that the situation is ripe for it, and they assess that, and they do that on purpose. And I don't believe that there was a single thing that my parents could have done or not do or not done that would have changed my experiences. I do believe that my abuser is a predator on the most basic level, and knew exactly how to assess the sort of situation that she was looking for, and it's really and genuinely not their fault. That being said, this has been a process of healing for me and for my wife and for my siblings and for my parents. Although I don't blame them, as one might well expect, they do experience this amount of guilt that it happened on their watch, whether I feel that they should be blamed or not. And as a result of that, it's been a process of healing for them, and they've had to undergo dealing with those feelings of guilt, as anyone who's affected by this issue goes through those sorts of experiences and has to deal with the emotions accordingly. But on any and every level, I really genuinely do not believe that anything that happened was related to their activity or inactivity at all.
To dovetail on that question, so though your parents you don't blame your parents at all because there's nothing they could have done. But for those of us that are parents, and all the parents out there, what can we do if you were going to guide your parents in helping you in your situation, not knowing what was going on? What guidance would you give for them to address this? Just walk over to your children. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense for me to walk over to each of my children and say, hey, are you being molested? Are you being molested? I don't think that makes sense. So what advice would you give?
So
And Avremi, to answer and to add to that, also as a parent that you are now with
right.
children,
So
how would you address that?
exactly. I think that's an important caveat, is that so go ahead, Nassim.
Yeah, no, and if I could just refine that question a little bit, I'm sure there's some preventative measures that you could take in the home environment, but then there's also, how can you be in tune with your child to notice a pattern of abuse, and what kind of relationship can you think a parent can model having with their child that will foster an openness from the child in a healthy way if they are going through abuse?
So there's a lot here, and I want to try to do this one by one. So obviously, as Menachem very correctly pointed out, for me, this is the most personal issue now, because I'm now a parent myself. I have now 2 little boys who are 5.5 and 3.5, and obviously, I would never want them to remotely go through anything similar to what I went through. And so for me, this is a very pressing issue, and it's the reality is it's the question that I get most often whenever I do one of these gigs. And so I always tell the story because I feel like it's a story which, as we say, this one can learn from, but you can learn from, in a not in a negative way, but learning what not to do. Shortly before my story came out, there were certain family members that I wanted to tell personally. I didn't want them to read this, as Rabbi Landa was saying. I didn't want them to know about this on WhatsApp. I wanted them to hear this, from me originally. And so there was a cousin of mine who's a Chabad rabbi on a college campus here in the United States, and I called him up. Probably 3 months before it went public, and I told him the story, and he was very distraught on the phone. We were very close as kids. We're a few months apart, and he hung up. We talked for a couple of minutes, and he hung up, and he calls me back about 15 minutes later, and he says, I just want to let you know I'm so shook up by what you told me, and my wife and I are both very busy, very active here on a college campus, and as such, we very often have caregivers for our children. And after what you told me, what happened with your babysitter, I just want to let you know how bothered my wife and I were. We called anyone and everyone who has ever cared for our kids, and we fired them all, sight on scene. We just, lined them up in a series of phone calls and text messages, and just got rid of all of them because of, what happened to you. And I thought that the gesture contained therein was very sweet, but I laughed because, the reality is that, sadly, the world we live in today has shown us that people who seek to do harm to children are not limited to one segment of the population. They don't have one job. They don't look like one, form of people. They're manifest in any and every segment of humanity. And so to say that, I'm not going to expose my kids to babysitters or basketball coaches or swim coaches or rabbis or doctors or uncles, because, that there have been numerous stories of abuse in every one of those segments of the population is obviously foolish. And it's the question that I love getting whenever I have one of these talks is, very often the way the question will be worded is, what can I do as a parent to guarantee that my child will never be exposed to someone who seeks to do them harm? And as I tell people, and I don't know if it's what they want to hear, but for me, it's the truth. If you want to guarantee that there's one thing, if you want to guarantee that your children will never cross paths with someone who wants to do them harm, there's one thing you can do. Take your child, wrap them up in bubble wrap, and lock them in a closet in your home. If you do that, I guarantee they will never, ever cross paths with someone who wants to harm them in any way, shape, or form. But obviously, we're not going to do that. That's not where we're at. Instead, I think what's really crucial over here as parents, what we can do, and thus what we must do, is to provide a space for our children where there is a freedom and there is a level of comfort for them to bring up any issue to us as parents, even an issue that might make them feel uncomfortable, even if it's an issue which they feel by bringing it up to their parents, they are somehow, in their childish state of mind, somehow incriminating themselves for doing something wrong, for having been in some sort of inappropriate relationship. And I often use the following example. To be fair, I'm a child of the 90s and the early 2000s. When I was a kid, my parents didn't speak to me about this, and I don't think it's because they were Chabad or they were Orthodox. This wasn't discussed. as far as I was aware for my generation. When I went to summer camp every year, which was kind of my token experience into the outside world with other kids my age and leaving behind the bubble of Salt Lake City, every single year on the way to the airport, my parents would have the exact same talk with us kids. And that was that when you'll be in camp, if somebody hits you or someone is violent to you or physically harms you or threatens you, and they tell you that you need to keep their secret because they will keep on harming you, if you tell anybody, you should never be afraid of any adult in camp. And if someone puts you in that sort of situation, at the first instance, run to a payphone, call home, and your father will get on a plane and come beat the living daylights out of that staff member because your father is stronger than that staff member. And thus you need not be scared of that adult in camp who is trying to make you keep their secret. So if I go to camp and one night, the counselor comes over hypothetically and pulls me out of the bunkhouse and puts me on the porch, just me and him, and he smacks me across the face. And he says, you better not tell anybody what just happened. Because if you do, if you tell someone, I will hit you again and again and again and again every time you speak out about this matter. I know what to do. I have been given skills for this exact situation. The next morning, I get myself to a phone and I call home and my father comes down and I don't need to worry about keeping the counselor's secret. What if instead, hypothetically, the counselor takes me out of the bunkhouse or takes me on the porch and it's just me and him, and he hands me $100 bill. And he says, this $100 bill is a lot of money for a little boy. It's yours to keep. You can hang on to this so long as you don't tell anybody where the money comes from. If you tell someone where the money comes from, I'm going to have to take the money back. But if you don't tell anybody where the money comes from, you can keep the $100. And in fact, if you don't tell anybody for an entire week, at the end of the week, I will give you another $100, and so on and so on and so forth. I will give you more money every time you keep quiet. At that point, when I go back into the bunkhouse with the $100 in my pocket, I'm not concerned about keeping his secret. Now I'm keeping my secret because I'm concerned now that if this somehow gets out, first of all, I'm going to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to lose the money. Did I do the right thing by accepting this? Should I be keeping secrets? Those are the sorts of situations that we can empower our children to feel comfortable and confident to speak up to us as their parents. Even if they feel that by somehow speaking up, they're going to be losing out as the child, they're going to feel uncomfortable, they're going to be losing the money, and no one really did anything wrong to them. That is classic grooming behavior. And it's those sorts of situations where we really can encourage our children and create an environment where they feel comfortable, where they feel welcomed to discuss any sort of topic with us, where there is a non-judgmental atmosphere, where there's a reality that whatever they'll share with us, we will respect them, we will love them, we will never make them feel remotely awkward or uncomfortable for whatever they're sharing. That is how we create an environment where children are encouraged to speak up. And so, to answer the specifics of the question, Rabbi Potash asked about, are there symptoms, are there side effects that you can look out for? There are a dime a dozen. There are tremendous resources online. There are so many good organizations. To be totally honest with you, Rabbi Potash, I think if you take a look at the list of possible behaviors that children display that might speak to, them having been exposed to a predator, I think at some level, every child that's ever walked the face of the earth exhibits some of those symptoms from time to time. Sadly, most very common childhood behaviors are the byproducts of them having been in an uncomfortable situation. And so it is more difficult to kind of go by that list, though there are some pretty foolproof ones that are good to know. But the reality is ultimately what we can do as parents is really encourage our children to have the most open and honest relationship with us as parents, as that is really the way to root out this sort of behavior.
Thank you. Thank you, Avremi. This is, you brought it into a practical process for me as a parent, and I'm sure for many others. One of the questions, before I go into how this has transformed your life, one of the questions that was one of the people asked is, she said she's a psychotherapist working with children who were sexually molested, and she's currently treating somebody who's almost 40 years old, who started therapy because of COVID, and in the process opened up about being abused. Where would you guide somebody towards beginning the process that you went through? You obviously didn't have the support, call this number, go this place. Where would you guide somebody, go straight to the police, or are there organizations that help with this? Somebody who's older, looking to go through the process, is maybe something you want to answer offline, but
also an adult survivor?
Yes.
An adult survivor, I would say, don't go near the police at first. For adult survivors, it is paramount importance to absolutely make sure that one is in a healthy place of dealing with these sorts of issues. And I would encourage anyone who's experienced any sort of childhood trauma in their life, or sexual violence of any kind, in beginning to deal with this, the most important step is to find a good mental health professional, specifically someone who's trained in areas of trauma. But at times, what's most important is to find one trustworthy human being. And I think what I've seen in my experiences, it's remarkable who people find to be that token human being. At times it's a family member, at times it's a close friend or a member of the clergy. At times it could be a perfect stranger. And I think what's remarkable about the tremendous networking, especially during COVID, where the whole world has gone online, but the networking that's available through the internet is, I encourage people to reach out, whether it's to someone online that might be involved in this sort of thing, to someone that they feel perfectly comfortable with getting the words off their chest, even if it's anonymously, even if it's writing an email to a survivor figure in the community, just detailing what happened to them. That is usually a great first step. And then I encourage people to go to a trauma therapist and really begin to process. And for most adult survivors, involving law enforcement is not something which they certainly want to do. In many instances, it's very complex, it's very tricky. In many instances, their abuser is no longer alive. And I think it's important that I clarify, just for the sake of clarity, I wasn't looking for a lengthy trial and jail sentence. Ultimately, what I was looking for in the entire process was acknowledgement and acceptance. I wanted my abuser to be sat down by someone and to be said, you really did some terrible things and you need to get some help. And I would have been perfectly content for her to say, you're right, sure. I really need to take a good, long, hard look in the mirror and figure out what's wrong. And ultimately, that's not something that she was up for doing. And so the justice system played itself out. But people really need to heal, and healing is such a multifaceted journey, and a journey that looks like so many different things for so many different people. And I encourage people, number one, find a single token human being on this world that you can share your experiences with, that you can get comfortable with just expressing yourself in that way, of saying things that you've kept cooped up for decades and decades and decades, and slowly to begin the healing process by getting to a mental health professional, by working with someone who's trained in the field, and allowing yourself to unburden from all that.
Okay, so I'm going to put you in touch with one of the with this person afterwards, because they're still struggling finding the right balance. But I think that you may be able to give them some more direct guidance. So we've spoken a lot about the pain and the trauma and the impact it's had on you negatively. Now, 3 years later, after this process has begun, your abuser's in jail, no longer able to abuse anybody. Talk about how this has changed you and transformed you as a person. I'm sure this is still something that you deal with on some level. I'm only going to guess that you're still in therapy somewhat, because these things don't disappear. But at the same time, you've grown into an advocate for overcoming sexual abuse, and you speak many different places. So talk a little bit about how this process has changed you, and more specifically, where it has changed you as a result of, opening up, and how do you let go? I mean, this is something that affected you in a very deep way. I'm sure on some level this is your identity, and how do you let go of all you know, and become a different person through that? So, a bunch of questions in one.
Sure, I want to kind of go down two different roads with that. I'll start from the end. I often tell the story of my first therapy appointment. So this was the one that I wasn't very excited about going to, and I got there and found out the guy was Jewish, and you heard all about that. And I shared with him in the beginning of the conversation, I was going to be very honest with him. I was not interested in being there, and frankly, I was kind of doing it to satisfy other people's desire that I sort myself out. And we had a good chat. We had a very productive chat. Spoke for an hour. And I had disclosed to a human being that I had been sexually abused, and we started discussing that. So at the end of the hour, I turned to him and I said, okay, this was not bad. I have to say, all things considered, this was a lot better than I expected. You were not as horrible as I had envisioned. So, doctor, how many more times do you want to see me? And the point that I was trying to convey to him, not in so many words, was, I had knee surgery a few years before this. I broke my leg. You break your leg, you go and see a surgeon. He fixes you up, sends you to the physical therapist. They give you some pills, they give you some physical therapy. And 6 months later, you're good. You never see them again. You never see the therapist again. You never see the doctor again. You have nothing to do with them. They're great people, but God bless them. You don't want a long-term relationship with your doctor. And so the message I was trying to convey to him was, so what's the game plan here? Like, am I going to see you for a couple of weeks? And you'll give me some pills, some books, some exercises. I don't plan on doing this for a long time. And he looked at me and he smiled. He says, tell you what, why don't you come back next week and we'll take it from there? And we've joked about, since then, kind of the message that he was conveying in so many words was, that's not quite how this is going to work. There will never come a time where I will hand you a doctor's note that says, you have been healed from sexual abuse, go back into the world and, take care of yourself and you're good to go. For me, that was the most difficult part and probably the most crucial part, was the acceptance that this is something which will be with me forever. This is not something which I will ever walk away from, which I will graduate from, which I will be able to disassociate myself from. This is going to be my reality forever. This is the path that I was given to walk. At a certain point, acceptance and just kind of surrendering to that is about the only thing you can do. And being open to that being the life's journey that you never really expected, but is very much your reality. That was an important part of the process. And that's something which I had to go through. And that took a lot of time. It's still not, a bouquet of roses to realize that. And there are days that I'm quite resentful that's my story. That's my reality. And I'd like nothing more than being able to walk away from that, but I can't. And for me, accepting that and realizing that and believing that there's some sort of purpose in it is really the only thing which gives me the ability to continue. When I think about what my experiences have done to me and what's changed in me since all of this, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a panel about a month ago at this point. There was a young Chabad girl in Brooklyn who took her own life. It was a very, very tragic story. This was a young girl who had struggled with a variety of mental health issues throughout the years and had made remarkable progress, had just been accepted into a nursing program within the mental health space, had made some incredible comebacks in her own life. And at some point it just got too much. And at the end of December, she took her own life. And so there were a number of us that put together a panel at the end of December to really kind of discuss the taboo around mental health in our community to make sure that something like this should never happen again. And so one of the questions that I got is, how can I create an environment for my friends who are struggling? What can I do if I know someone in my community who's going through something, to make them feel welcome, to make them feel at home, to really encourage them to feel strong in what they're grappling with. And so I shared with the person who was asking something which is very profound for me, and that is that obviously if someone comes to us and tells us that they're struggling with a mental health issue, none of us are cold-hearted or callous and would mock that issue or make them feel uncomfortable, and we'd all know what to say. But do we think about what we do subconsciously? Do we think about the comments we make and the environment that we create without even realizing? And I shared with this person that I had been in touch with, actually with a survivor in our community, who was feeling really encouraged to share with some of her friends within the Chabad community her experiences. And one day they were walking down the street in Crown Heights, and across the street there was, an older person in the community who struggles with mental health issues, who was having an episode on the other side of the street. And the friend that she was walking with started making light of the situation, started mocking the situation, which is an uncomfortable thing that we do at times. But the young person shared with me that when she saw how her friend treated illness, treated someone who is clearly struggling in that moment, that made her shut down. And that really made it impossible for her to entertain the idea of coming forward with her own mental health issues, because we see how we talk about these things subconsciously. We see how sometimes we'll let a remark slip, we'll poke fun at someone who's struggling without them knowing, just kind of, amongst us friends. And for me, what I've learned from my experiences is that everyone is going through something. Absolutely everybody's going through something. And I think about the moments and the episodes and the conversations where I wish people would have known what I was going through, and thus they would have wanted to create a safer space for me to feel comfortable. For me, my experiences have given me the reality check that every single person that I come in contact with is going through something. And every single time I'm walking down the street with somebody and I see something happening outside me, I have no idea what the person standing beside me is going through and how the slightest, most innocent comment might rock their world if it somehow comes across as inappropriate. And so for me, my experiences have, which I'm very grateful for in that sense, have given me the opportunity to view life very, very differently, to realize that everyone is going through something, to create an environment that everyone who is going through something can feel comfortable, and to really allow that to be a motivating force in my life.
Amazing, Avremi, that you're able to be on that panel, and we know who you're talking about from back in December. That was a dark day, and that you're able to be there and speak to people and encourage people in a positive light is amazing. I'm going to bring you back, actually, as we're on this session tonight together. Actually, Avremi, I was at your wedding in the Crown Plaza. It was a great wedding. Your uncle spoke.
Everyone's in the Crown Plaza, so just because you know
right,
the Crown Plaza doesn't.
Right. Your uncle gave a great, very long speech that I was able to have 2 desserts during that speech, Rabbi Shachat, right? If you remember.
I think I was having dessert too, so yeah.
I did want to ask you, where's your wife in this picture? Has she been supportive? What was it like to share the news with her? I'm sure she was one of the first people that you shared this with. And how has she been along this journey? Because while it's public for you, it's public for her as well. She probably doesn't get interviewed by all the media as you are, but where does she come in this?
So I think the best way to answer this question is some of the terminology my wife herself has used. A couple months ago, we were having this conversation at our Shabbat dinner table, and my wife was sharing with someone what it was like for me to disclose to her, and she was trying to give this person a sense of how ridiculous, for lack of a better term, it was for her to hear this sort of thing. And she shared with this person that if I would have come back from therapy that day and shared with my wife that in the 22 years before I knew her, I had been a very, very accomplished astronaut and had taken numerous missions to outer space, that would have been more plausible than what I actually shared with her. You know, my wife came from a mentality which was the same mentality as mine before I went to therapy, that these sorts of things don't happen in our community. You know, when you're meeting a young man who might be your husband, you would never entertain in a million years that, you know, the young man you're dating was sexually abused for a long time and has been coping with that and dealing with that, and that is about to become a very tangible part of your own life. And as a result of that, it was a huge healing process for her. I think that, you know, well, on a very basic level, my wife has been remarkably supportive of it, and it's only with her support and through her support that I've, you know, been able to be in this role and to take the steps that I have. But my wife has really, you know, realized, as we all have, that this is a healing process for everyone involved. I think back the last day of my abuser's trial, during her closing arguments, the prosecutor got up and spoke about the fact that sexual abuse is a bomb. You know, when it goes off, it doesn't just affect one person, it affects, you know, one person and their family and their family and their family and cities and communities wide. And so for everyone that it touches, you know, there's an intense healing process. And my wife has, you know, had the good fortune of having support and finding support and being able to be a support for others through her journey. But it's profoundly impacted her. It's profoundly impacted our relationship. And it's something which, you know, we both continue to try and work on and you know, make part of our reality. And I'm incredibly grateful for everything she has done along this road. And it's undoubtedly something which I could not do without her.
Wow, that is remarkable. Wow, amazing, Avremi.
Thank you.
Have that support. Wow, and everything she's going through. I'm going to go through 1 or 2 questions that people have asked me privately, and then I'm sure some of the other rabbis also have other questions. I do want to respect everyone's time. Did you ever think of going to your parents as a, let's say, 10-year-old? Or did you feel too much shame to go to them? What was your feeling of, I guess, in one sentence, why did you not go to your parents?
During my abuser's trial, there was a moment that I think really encapsulated what this is like for a child. My abuser's attorney, during the cross-examination, got very worked up, and he, you know, in his great rage, he turned to him and he said, Did my client ever harm you? I said, no. Did my client ever threaten you? Absolutely not. Did my client ever in any way insinuate that if you were to talk about this, you would be harmed? And I said, no. And he thought that, this would somehow paint his client in a better light. And on the redirect, the prosecutor, who was in a stroke of genius, stood up and she said, why? He makes some good points. Why did she never harm you? Why did she never threaten you? Why did she never intimidate you? And as I explained to her, and I explained to the court, and as I explained to everyone, she didn't need to. Because, the reality is, I think my abuser realized that I was more scared of protecting myself than I was about protecting her. And so, for me to discuss what was going on, to my parents, to anyone who was, part of the frum community, was the absolute last thing I would have done in my entire life. Not because of what it meant for her, because of what it meant for me, because of how I felt I would be portrayed and how I felt I would be viewed. And as far as I was concerned, it was the end of life as I knew it. And so I think that, I never spoke up about it. I made every good effort to push with two hands any remote idea of speaking up about it, because I was terrified of how I would be perceived as a result of that. And the shame and the guilt that would haunt me for forever and ever and ever was a very real reality for me. And I think that is so much part and parcel of all of these instances of childhood sexual abuse that like I said, predators really have a way of scoping out, situations where their behavior will work. And I think my abuser found a very dynamic situation with it being part of a religious community and all the taboo associated with it. And yeah, that's the short answer to the question.
Wow. Remy, of course, just as Jews, we're certainly connected. The fact that we're both Chabad rabbis, I feel like a brother of yours. And obviously you were struggling with so much pain for so long. And I just feel honored to be a colleague of yours while we're doing our jobs in different states. But I feel soulfully we're strongly connected, doing it all together. And I feel very privileged to be a colleague standing side by side with you and doing our job to bring Mashiach. Another question that's just coming in that someone asked me privately, going back to the court hearings and from the prosecution and everything, did the nanny, your abuser, ever express guilt, remorse, regret?
No.
Wow.
No, and my abuser is doing 25 years to life at the Utah State Prison. In all likelihood, she will most likely die behind bars, and that's not what I was hoping for out of the situation. I remember after I had testified for the first time and the case really began moving forward. One day I sat down with the prosecutor and she says, the custom is that we offer a deal. Is there a deal that is agreeable to you? Can we make a deal that, that would spare you a trial and spare you having to go back on the stand? And is there something that you're up for? And I talked with the people who were close to me, and I went back to the prosecutor. I said, sure, my abuser was charged with 7 felonies. I want her to plead guilty to one, just take one felony and plead guilty to it and get up in open court and say, yeah, Your Honor, I'm guilty as charged. She was arrested on suspicion of 130 counts of sexual abuse. She was charged with 7 felonies, which were the 7 they could prove. And all I asked was for her to take one. And to the point that we had drawn up an offer where if she were to take one, I would actually go to the judge during sentencing and ask for a more lenient jail sentence. And she and her attorneys rejected the deal out of hand. And they wanted nothing to do with it. They felt strongly it should go to trial, and here we are. Trial was trial. And so the answer to your question is no. And to me, it's the thing which I most yearn for. A jury convicted her, and she's doing the time that she's doing, and that's all that. But no, I never had the opportunity to have that acknowledgement ever given to me. Thank you,
Avremi. One last question that came in here, and then we're already past time, so I want to wrap up. The question that this person asked is, are you in this process? You could have just simply said, I did my trial, I'm done, or she did her trial essentially, and she's in jail. Let's put this behind us and let's move forward. By doing this advocacy, you're also holding on to it. And it's a kind of a bit of a catch-22, because if you let it go, you're not helping the others. If you deal with it, it becomes part of you. And, talk a little, just in 1 minute how you're managing that kind of both sides of that.
So here's the reality. Every time I speak about this, it takes something out of you. You know, it's not something you can just sit back and, you know, just kind of schmooze about. You know, it does take something out of you to talk about it. At the same time, every single time I've had the opportunity to speak about this, I've had the incredible opportunity to meet other survivors, you know, who follow up after the event. And I'll actually use the time now to put this in the chat. I always, you know, put out here, I've dedicated an email address specifically for this topic. It's totally confidential. It's not on our Chabad server if anyone wants to reach out and continue the conversation in private. And in every single one of these speeches that I've done, I've always had the opportunity through them to connect with other survivors. And I have to say that every single person that I connect with, every single story that I hear from somebody else gives me hope. It gives me strength. It gives me, you know, optimism and a reason to believe that things, you know, will continue and that I'll be better and that they'll be better. And it, you know, it's a double-edged sword. It does cost something from you, but it does give you something in return as well. Beyond that, more than that, bigger than that. And I often tell people, you know, I made a choice to live a life of shlichus. You know, it was something which I wanted to always do, to be a shliach, to live a life of dedication to my community, and it's a life which requires, you know, a little bit of selflessness, granted, and for me, having the opportunity to make a difference in the arena is a shlichus for me. It's an opportunity to make a difference in a situation that I'm uniquely positioned to do, and so on a certain level, I've really come to believe that the only reason why the Almighty God puts people in certain situations is so that they can make a difference in those situations. And if that's what I believe, how can I turn that down? How can I deny that opportunity? How can I, you know, leave God hanging in a certain sense? And so for me, it's, you know, there is a higher calling in it, and there is, you know, sort of a sense of mission and purpose in it. And it's that hope that, you know, this is what God has in mind for me, and this is what I was sent down into this world to make a difference in, that really does sustain me and keeps me going.
Wow. Thank you, Avremi, for Rabbi Zippel, Avremi, my brother-in-law, for sharing your story, being vulnerable, being open. You know, you go into these events thinking this is going to be a painful topic, but, you know, I'm leaving with hope and optimism that there's a lot that, you know, there's a lot of hope out there that through you sharing your story, others won't have to suffer. And we thank you for coming tonight. And I actually put your email in there. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, that is a good way.
Please do.
And thank you to the three Chabads that partnered here tonight, Chabad Coal Valley, Chabad Novato, and us. And thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you all very much. Have a good night. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.